What's up, summoners? King Blair here. Today, we're going to be talking about immunity sets. Now, for some reason, this is still a highly debated topic in the Epic 7 community, with some people thinking it's useless and some people thinking that every single unit needs it. Well, I'm here to try to explain to you guys a little bit more when you need immunity and when you should consider having immunity, and why at the end of the day, it is a very strong set in PvP and you should be farming it if you can. So, if you like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server. Link down in the description. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Immunity set. So how the video will roll out is first we will start about what it is, what it gives you. Then we'll go on what units would need it and what situations they're necessary. Then we'll talk about kind of like considerations for what those brackets are, and then show actual examples with some of the units that I have on immunity set and some of the things that you really should be having on immunity. But first, let's start on what is it? What does it even do? Right? When should you, why? So what immunity set does is it gives you immunity to debuffs for a single turn at the beginning of the battle, and it does not stack, right? So it is a 2-piece set, which means it's taking the place of something like a critical hit set, an effect resistance set, a health, or a defense set. So when you start thinking about that, you realize that you are giving up consistent stats that you get throughout a fight for the benefit of one turn of immunity from debuffs. For some people, that may be too much. And for PvE, it absolutely is. There's no unit that you should use for PvE that needs immunity set that wouldn't be better off using another set. So for all intents and purposes, for PvE, yes, you do not need immunity for PvE. You can clear all Epic 7 content with no immunity set at all. And if anything, it probably hurts your PvE if you're using immunity set on those units, because resist set, crit set, they just provide consistent stat boost throughout the whole fight. But immunity sets start to become very important in PvP, where losing those stats, losing that 12% crit, losing that 20% F-res, losing that 15% health or that 15% defense is the difference between you getting a turn 1 or not against debuff heavy units, right? So that's what it does. It is a very turn 1 heavy set. So with that, who needs it, right? There are two categories of units that need immunity set. And yes, I do mean need quite literally. The ones that need it are units that are slow relatively to what they're trying to do. And that's a really big one, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the other one is going to be units that have critical S3s, like game-breaking S3s that if you don't get this S3 off, you're probably losing the fight. Right? So those are the two units, and sometimes they kind of interchange, but it's basically any unit that's relatively slow in the grand scheme of things, and units that, for the most part, have very critical S3s that you need to get out. So if you're curious, now let's start with the relatively slow. What do I mean by that? Well, I made a video talking about it way more in depth about the speed brackets, and that's something that you really need to understand when you need immunity. It's going to be the speed brackets. What are your speed threats, right? For example, if you're using someone like a Ross is going to be faster than all these other units, right? But he's not faster than an Cerise, and Cerise can stun Ross with an S2. Right? So understanding those threats and understanding your speed threats will also help you in deciding what unit needs immunity or not. And we'll talk about that when we go through the examples. The other one, that's talking about relatively slow, because Ross is a fast unit, but compared to Cerise, he's slow. So I would actually recommend Ross needs to be on immunity, because if you don't, Cerise will S2 you, and Cerise is very popular right now. So with that in mind, let's actually look at some units and some examples of both of these scenarios combined, both the critical ones and the relatively slow for what they're trying to do, and having big S3s, right? And we'll talk about, so first let's start with the units that absolutely need immunity. That it's just like, it's a no-brainer. If you don't have immunity on these units, there's a problem. Then we'll talk about the ones that are highly suggested. Then we'll talk about the gray area, and then we'll talk about the nose, right? That don't really need it. So first, let's talk about the absolutely needed. There's a couple of these. First, the most basic one, Kayron. Unless you're using a speed Kayron. But for the most part, Kayron needs immunity. Why? He's a pretty slow unit that can extend his buffs on the S3, right? The S3 is able to extend the buffs. He can do big damage and extend the immunity set, getting even more value of the immunity set, right? But without it, something like a Fallen Cecilia, something like a Cerise can S2 him, or can just S1 him, or a Tywin can just S3 him, or a Dizzy can S3 him. There are a lot of threats to Kayron. And if you get a debuff on you and you're not able to get that S3 off, you lose the game, right? So Kayron, no brainer, pretty slow, very critical S3. Another unit is SSB. This unit is a turtle. And there are so many people that don't have immunity in their SSBs. I do not know why. Put immunity in your SSBs. If she's slower than I don't think there's any viable speed SSB built out there. SSB needs immunity. That's a no-brainer. Because if you don't have immunity in your SSB and they lock her down turn 1, whether it's a Fallen Cecilia or anything like that, you don't get this huge S3, which means that you basically lose to Rana quite easily, right? Or if they have a stunner, they can just stun you like a Cerise S2, and now you're not getting S2s off, which means you're not getting decreased defenses, you're not doing anything. She's just a useless unit, and because she's so slow, it will take her a very long time to cycle to a position where she's working again. By then, you already probably lost the game, right? So that's why, again, SSB, kind of a no-brainer, right? Those two are the biggest needs immunities in the game, that they are units that are absolute musts, right? So now let's start getting to the units that are highly recommended, if not almost required. So one of them is going to be Lilius. The only build that Lilius doesn't need immunity on is Ephras, and we'll cover that in a second. But units like Lilius that have extremely impactful S3s, but are quote-unquote slow, right? So she really needs immunity. Why? This S3 is game-changing. If you get this S3 off against a ton of units in the game, you would pretty much win the fight. But if a Cerise can S2 you, that's not as scary anymore, right? Or if you're slow with a damage Lilius, they just S1 you with a Tywin, they S1 you with Fallen Cecilia, they can General Purgus S3 you, depending on how fast that General Purgus is, or if you lost turn 1, and then you just lose, right? So Lilius, another unit that really does need immunity, because you need to get that S3 off. This S3 is probably what's letting you win the game, right? You need to have that off. Another unit is going to be a unit like Cecilia, right? Which I know I'm using a lot of RGB, and that's because I'm currently in an all RGB state. But units like Cecilia, again, very critical S3. You want to get this S3 off. You want to get immunity up for the rest of your team. You don't want to get stunned by a Cerise pretty early. You don't want that, right? These are units with very impactful S3s. Another unit that kind of does fall into this category is going to be a unit like Briar Witch, which I see a lot of people not putting on immunity. Briar Witch has an insane S3 that if you get off this S3, you pretty much win the game. And so many people don't have her in immunity, and then they get stunned or provoked, and they lose the game, right? Because they get outsped and then they just lose, right? You just straight up lose, right? So Briar Witch needs that immunity because she has a critical S3. That's why it's so important for critical S3 units to have that immunity. Some other units that are right now are currently not geared on my account that are still units that really need it is going to be someone like even Fallen Cecilia, right? And most bruisers do need it. And I will say most, right? So Fallen Cecilia not currently build. Again, my account is currently full RGB, but she needs immunity. She has a huge S3 that needs to get off, right? You need to get this S3 off. It does damage, it applies skill nullifier, it does so much. You need immunity on this unit, and then the same thing goes for a unit like General Purgus. Again, this is a PvE one, right? So I made sure PvE doesn't matter. He's on health set. But if this is a PvPG perk, he will need to be on immunity because he has a critical S3 he's trying to get to this S3 for the rest of your team, right? So he needs immunity. And we can go on and on units like this. Sage Ball, again, he needs immunity. Can you build him dummy fast? Yes. Does he still need immunity? Probably. Why? Because Cerise exists, and Cerise will almost always outspeed you. So that's going to be the highly recommended. So now, with the highly recommended out of the way, let's talk about the units that are kind of in the gray zone. And these are units where different players will tell you different things, which is going to be mostly the DPS units. So let's take a look at my Sirmia. My Sirmia does not have immunity. Why? Well, I made the conscious choice that I was going to lose to Cerises because that's the only thing that can outspeed me at the speed bracket. I made that choice, right? That's something I made, but I thought it was more critical to get that extra crit rate, to get that extra damage on there. So my Sirmia is on a high speed build. I know Cerise beats me. I have to accept that, right? I can't change that. Cerise will beat me. But for the most part, there's not any other speed threat where immunity would help me with. I outspeed most Arbiter Vildreds. I outspeed every single A Tywin. I outspeed almost every single Fallen Cecilia. I outspeed most things that can ruin my day, right? Except Cerise. So that's something I accepted, and that's why I didn't give my Sturmia any immunity, right? Then you look at a unit like Arbiter Vildred. Again, same thing. Arbiter Vildred is a unit that is, for the most part, almost always on a crit set, right? This is not a finalized Arbiter Vildred. Again, I have him just for farming right now, but he doesn't need immunity per se, because you can build him 240 speed and outspeed. Now, the part where it starts getting more into the need is if your Arbiter Vildred is the speed. If your Arbiter Vildred is anything slower than 230, you're at a risk for units like A Tywin and Fallen Cecilia provoking you. But if you're over 230, then it's not a threat anymore, right? So usually under 230, you probably need to consider immunity. Over 230, you don't need immunity, because there's nothing that can really provoke you and make you lose your turn. But again, kind of a gray area, right? Some people will tell you he needs it. Some people will tell, nah, just go all damage, man. And then you also have to consider the uses. And that's why a lot of these units are also in that category, right? So let's look at a unit like Ravi, who's a perfect example of a unit that kind of doesn't follow the path, right? She's slow. She gets stunned by Cerise. She gets provoked by Fallen Cecilia. Why does she usually not have immunity? Not a lot of people have immunity in the Ravis. Very few. And I don't think she needs it. Why? You may be wondering, that doesn't make sense, King Blair. Why would she usually not need immunity? Why is that an option people make? Well, this is a perfect example of functionality, right? She doesn't have a critical S3 she needs to get turn 1. She has capabilities to cycle and be able to get rid of debuffs. She doesn't really need that turn 1 as much. She's not a turn 1 unit, right? That's not her job. And she also has self-cleansing on the S1. So she's a unit that does not have a critical S1 or turn 1. Why give immunity when you can be having more damage and better stats, right? So that's where you start getting to functionality, and where it's kind of a gray zone on needing or not needing, right? So Ravi doesn't necessarily need immunity. That's a choice you make. If you're someone that is running a Ravi for a very critical turn 1 situation, then you probably need immunity. But for the most part, she's not a turn 1 unit. She doesn't need immunity per se, right? She's perfectly okay doing without it as well. Holiday Yuffie needs immunity. She's not part of this category. But then Ken would need immunity. But again, that's just something that you should consider. And for most DPSs, this is the situation, right? If it's a DPS, you need to consider, am I okay losing to X unit, right? So for example, for Landy, I would highly recommend you put your Landy on immunity, but it's not necessarily needed because functionality plays a role. What if I made this Landy dummy, like big damage, right? And I'm pairing her with units that can push her up. Do I need immunity there? No, not really. I'd rather get that big damage than immunity for that one turn because I'm already getting turn 1, right? That immunity doesn't become as impactful, right? So it depends. There's functionality to this stuff. Same thing with something like my Violet, right? My Violet is not on immunity. Why? I mean, if I'm getting stunned by an F10A, I probably was already going to get stunned, right? He's already so slow. He cleanses. If they're wasting turns to stop me from doing this S2, I mean, that means that they're wasting a lot of resources on him, and he's not completely useless without the S2. It's just, it'd be nice to have an immunity, but he's kind of that gray zone, right? Where am I taking him? Am I taking him to contest against Fallen Cecilias? Not usually, right? I'm usually taking him in other situations. So not as important. So that's the gray zone characters. And then last but not least, there's the units that don't need, or like it's just kind of overkill. And some of these units are units, for example, like Basarov is in the other category. It's a functionality one. For me, I don't trust my Basar. It's not fast enough, right? In my bracket. But then there's units like the Stinas, right? They don't need immunity, right? They already have high FRES. I'd rather put an FRES set, up this FRES, and then be better, right? Someone like my Elena. Would it be nice to have immunity on them? Yes, absolutely. It would be great to have immunity on them. But I would much rather have a effect rest set, get that extra stat, and make it less likely to get debuffs. So again, this one's kind of like an obvious one, but if you're using FRES, high FRES units don't really need immunity. Another one would be a unit like Craw, where he has a pretty important S2 and S3, but for the most part, if you have a 150 FRES, this is not a good example, by the way, he should be 150, but if you have a 150 FRES, I'd rather have him on a different set, right? Yes, it's important, but I'd rather have him have higher FRES because that means he can he needs to be able to resist later on rather than turn 1. So he's a unit that doesn't really need it. You probably prefer more FRES. 150 FRES means that Fallen Cecilia, it's not provoking you over and over again, and you can use your other skills. So that's the other situation where that would work. So I know it's a lot, and I know it's confusing, but to summarize this whole video, any unit that has a critical S3 needs immunity, and any unit that you have a functionality purpose that can get outsped by certain threats needs immunity. But that is all I got for you guys today. I hope y'all enjoy it, and I will see y'all next time. Peace.